As the years pass, we often see only the silver hair, the wrinkles, the slowing body, and wonder if love for ourselves has faded with time. But what if aging is not a loss, but a teacher? Through the wisdom of the Buddha, discover that impermanence is not an enemy, but a gentle guide. Each scar, each line, each moment of solitude is not proof of brokenness, but golden threads of resilience, compassion, and beauty. This is not the end of love. It is the beginning of a deeper, timeless love, the love within yourself. Aging is often portrayed as loss, the loss of youth, strength, and sometimes even self-worth. But Margaret's journey reminds us that this perspective is incomplete. Her story shows us that aging is not a closing door but a doorway to a new kind of love, deeper, softer, and more compassionate than the love we knew when we were young. From accepting impermanence to transforming solitude, her steps teach us that love for oneself doesn't depend on smooth skin or boundless energy. It grows through resilience, through compassion, and through the ability to see beauty in what once felt like flaws. The larger lesson is clear. Society may tell us that only the young are valuable, but life itself whispers another truth, that every stage of our journey carries wisdom worth honoring. Wrinkles are not signs of decline, they are maps of laughter and survival. Scars are not marks of shame, they are proof that we endured and transformed. In a culture obsessed with anti-aging, perhaps the radical act is not to fight time, but to embrace it, to choose gentleness over judgment, to discover that the later years of life can be the ripest, richest, and most luminous of all. Margaret stood in her small bathroom in suburban Ohio, brushing through her silver hair as the early morning light crept across the tiles. She paused, looking into the mirror. The reflection that stared back at her was not the face she remembered. The smooth skin was long gone, replaced by fine lines tracing decades of laughter, grief, and endurance. Her eyes, once bright and restless, now carried the weight of years lived deeply. She whispered quietly to herself, "Where did the years go?" It was a question she had asked before, a question many of us, sooner or later, find on our lips. Do you ever feel the same? You look at a photograph from your 20s and wonder how that person could possibly be the same as the one staring back at you today. You measure yourself against a younger version and somehow always come up short. For Margaret, the mirror often felt less like a friend and more like a judge, silently telling her that her value had faded along with her youth. But here's the thing, she's not alone. Millions of people, as they grow older, carry this quiet weight of regret, comparison, and fading worth. Society doesn't make it easier. Advertisements scream about creams to erase wrinkles, diets to reclaim youth, or cosmetic fixes to turn back time. It's as if the message is clear. You are only lovable when you are young. And yet, deep down, there is another truth waiting to be uncovered. Because aging does not have to mean the end of love. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Now, let's return to Margaret. As she stood there in the bathroom, she felt a tug in her chest, a mixture of sadness and curiosity. Was it really true that love for herself had passed away with her youth? Or could it be that she had been looking in the wrong places all along? That's when she remembered a phrase she had once read, drawn from Buddhist wisdom. Old age is not the end of love. It is the beginning of a deeper, more compassionate love than you may have ever known. The words settled into her heart like a warm ember. They didn't erase the wrinkles in the mirror, but they shifted the way she saw them. They invited her to look beyond the glass, beyond appearances, into something more lasting, something tender and strong that had been quietly waiting for her. Margaret realized that aging didn't mean she was less than she used to be. Perhaps it was an invitation. Perhaps the silver in her hair was not a sign of decline, but of ripening. Perhaps her slower pace wasn't weakness, but a gentle reminder to savor each step. The real question, she thought, wasn't how do I get my youth back, but rather, how do I love myself more fully in this very moment, just as I am? And so begins her journey, a journey through 6 lessons of wisdom, each one peeling back the illusion of loss and revealing a deeper kind of beauty. In the chapters that follow, Margaret will discover that impermanence can be a teacher, that letting go of the mirror self can set her free, that compassion for her own journey can soften old regrets, that gentle speech can heal wounds no one else can see, that solitude can be a friend, not an enemy, and that she is not alone, but forever woven into the great fabric of life. Along the way, she will also stumble upon a powerful metaphor, the Japanese art of Kintsugi, that will help her see her flaws not as shameful cracks, but as golden lines of strength and resilience. For Margaret, and for anyone who has ever felt the sting of time, this journey is not about pretending to be younger than you are. It is not about clinging desperately to what is already past. Instead, it is about opening your heart to the beauty of impermanence, to the tenderness of self-acceptance, and to the quiet strength of compassion. Because here's the truth, you are already worthy of love. Not tomorrow, not 10 years ago, but right here, right now. And if you stay with me until the end, you too may begin to see that what you once called your flaws are in fact the most radiant parts of your story. The next afternoon, Margaret found herself walking through Central Park in New York City. She had taken the train in from Ohio to visit her daughter, and while the younger woman was busy at work, Margaret wandered the winding paths beneath the trees. It was late autumn, and the air was cool but gentle, carrying the scent of dry leaves. Everywhere she looked, shades of gold and crimson clung to branches, only to tumble softly to the ground. She stopped to watch a child chase after a falling leaf, squealing with delight as it slipped from the air and crumbled in his hands. Margaret smiled faintly, but then felt a tug in her chest. She bent down, picked up a leaf, and traced its veins with her fingers. Once it had been vibrant green, bursting with life. Now, brittle and brown, it was preparing to return to the earth. For a moment, she thought of herself. Her knees ached more often these days. Her memory wasn't as sharp as it had once been. She walked slower, caught herself forgetting where she placed her reading glasses, and sometimes grew frustrated that her body no longer obeyed her the way it used to. Her instinct was to fight against it. She had tried coloring her hair, investing in expensive creams, even enrolling in fitness classes designed for active seniors. Each effort felt like pushing against a tide she could never hold back. The harder she tried, the more exhausted she felt. It reminded her of something she had once read in a book about Buddhist wisdom. What we resist persists, but what we accept transforms. Margaret paused on a park bench and let the phrase settle into her heart. She realized that impermanence, the truth that everything changes, was not just an abstract concept. It was sitting beside her in the form of fallen leaves. It was in the city skyline, where old buildings were constantly replaced by new ones. It was in her own reflection, where time had quietly painted its strokes. And yet, was that really a tragedy? Think about it. If nothing ever changed, would we know how to cherish anything? If children never grew up, how would parents ever learn the bittersweet joy of letting go? If the seasons never shifted, how would we savor the crispness of autumn or the promise of spring? Margaret thought of her late husband, James. He had passed away 7 years earlier, and for a long time she carried nothing but sorrow for the impermanence of their love. But now, sitting under the rustling canopy of Central Park, she realized something different. Their love had not been less because it ended. If anything, it had been more precious because it had an end. The laughter they shared, the quiet dinners, the way he would warm her hands on cold nights. Those memories were beautiful precisely because they could not last forever. A jogger passed by, pulling her out of her thoughts. Margaret watched the steady rhythm of his stride. Bodies change, she thought. Strength fades. But maybe the fading itself teaches us to care more tenderly. She thought of how she now treated herself more gently, eating slowly, walking carefully, resting when she needed. Wasn't that also a form of love? Her eyes drifted back to the leaf in her hand. She whispered, "You are not less than you were. You are part of life's unfolding." For the first time in a long while, she considered that perhaps she was not less than she used to be either. Perhaps this moment in her life, aches, wrinkles, slower steps and all, was just as sacred as her youth. Imagine this for yourself. Maybe you look in the mirror and notice the gray in your hair. Maybe your body doesn't move as quickly as it once did. Maybe you find yourself clinging to photos of your younger years. What if instead of mourning what has changed, you said to yourself, "This too is precious. This too belongs." Margaret felt the weight in her chest begin to loosen. She remembered how, when she was young, she thought she was invincible. Old age belonged to someone else, she used to believe. But now, as her body whispered reminders, she could no longer deny it. And yet, maybe that wasn't punishment. Maybe it was simply the rhythm of life. She took a slow breath, noticing how the cool air filled her lungs. With each exhale, she felt a little softer, a little more willing to let go of the fight. Impermanence had been her enemy for so long. But what if it could be her teacher? She began to see its lessons everywhere. Because life is short, she realized, she could release grudges more easily. Was it really worth carrying bitterness into her final decades? Because her body was fragile, she could treat it with kindness instead of judgment. Wasn't that what it needed most? And because everything changes, she could learn to treasure what was here now, instead of longing endlessly for the past. A group of teenagers walked past, laughing, snapping selfies. Margaret watched them, remembering when she was their age. For a brief moment, she felt a pang of envy. But then, unexpectedly, she felt something else, gratitude. Gratitude that she had lived long enough to see this day, this laughter, this slice of life unfolding before her. She leaned back on the bench and closed her eyes. The sound of leaves crunching under footsteps filled her ears. She thought of something her grandmother once told her when she was a child. Every wrinkle is a story, every gray hair a thread of wisdom. Perhaps, Margaret thought, aging was not about decline at all. Perhaps it was about becoming more of who she truly was, less distracted, less attached, more present. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower, Margaret stood and brushed the leaves from her coat. She felt different somehow, not entirely free of fear, but lighter. The wrinkles hadn't disappeared, the aches hadn't vanished, but her heart had softened. And that was the beginning. Because to love yourself in old age is not to deny impermanence, but to bow to it with grace. The next morning, Margaret sat at her vanity, a cup of warm coffee in her hand. The steam curled into the cool air of the room. She set the mug down, lifted her chin, and faced the mirror again. The light was sharp and honest, revealing every line on her face, every shadow under her eyes, the silver strands woven into her hair. For years, this ritual had been one of quiet dread. She remembered being a young woman who would lean into the mirror before a date, applying lipstick with a confident smile. Back then, the mirror felt like an ally, a friend that reflected possibility. But now, more often than not, it felt like an enemy, a judge whispering that she was no longer enough. She traced the lines around her mouth with her fingertips and sighed. "I don't look like me anymore," she thought. But then a memory surfaced. It was from just a few months ago, when her granddaughter Lily had stayed the weekend. Lily, only 8 years old, had climbed onto Margaret's lap, cupped her face in her little hands, and said, "Grandma, I love your smile maps." Margaret had laughed at the time. "Smile maps?" "Yeah," Lily said, pointing at the wrinkles near her eyes. "These lines, they show where your smiles have been. It's like a treasure map of happiness." That memory washed over her now like warm sunlight. For Lily, the lines were not flaws to be hidden. They were evidence of a life lived deeply, a cartography of joy. Margaret sat back in her chair, stunned by the contrast. She had spent years seeing those same lines as marks of decline, while her granddaughter saw them as proof of love. It struck her then. The mirror only told part of the story. She remembered a teaching she had read years earlier. The body is not truly the self. It is like a borrowed garment, useful, beautiful at times, but never ours to keep. The words rang true now in a way they never had before. Because if her worth was tied only to the reflection staring back at her, then it would mean she was less with every passing year. And yet, when she thought about the people she loved most in life, her friends, her children, even her late husband, it wasn't their appearance she cherished. It was their laughter, their kindness, their patience, the wisdom in their eyes. Why should it be any different for her? She leaned closer to the mirror, this time not to judge, but to look more carefully. Each wrinkle told a story. The lines near her eyes, Those had come from nights of laughter with James, from watching her children play soccer on muddy fields. The crease near her brow, born from nights of worry, waiting for her son to come home safely. The silver streaks in her hair, gifts from years of survival, each one marking battles endured and won. The mirror had been telling her she was fading, but maybe she realized it had been lying all along. Maybe beauty, she whispered, isn't in the reflection. Maybe it's in the story. She stood and walked to her dresser, where a stack of photo albums sat. Pulling one open, she found a picture of herself at 25, standing on a beach in California, wind in her hair. She studied the photo carefully. Yes, she was beautiful then, but that young woman hadn't yet lived through heartbreak, hadn't raised children, hadn't learned resilience, hadn't discovered the depth of compassion that only comes with time. Which face, she wondered, held more beauty? The smooth, untested youth, or the seasoned woman who had survived storms? She closed the album and returned to the mirror. This time, instead of asking, "How do I look?" she asked herself, "How deeply have I lived? How much compassion have I shared? How much wisdom have I gained?" The question struck her like a shift in gravity. For once, the mirror did not feel like a cage. It felt like a doorway. Imagine this for yourself. Next time you catch your reflection and feel the sting of self-criticism, pause. Instead of asking, "How do I look?" ask, "What story does this face tell?" You may find that your reflection carries more treasure than judgment. Margaret smiled softly at herself. She picked up her coffee and whispered, "You are more than this glass. You are the beauty of your being." And for the first time in years, the mirror smiled back. Later that week, Margaret sat in her living room, a soft rain tapping against the windows. On the coffee table in front of her rested a worn shoebox filled with pieces of her past, old photographs, faded letters, and documents she had kept over the years. She had been meaning to sort through them for months, but always avoided it. Too many memories, too many reminders of the things she wished had gone differently. But today, with the rain as her companion, she opened the box. The first item she pulled out was her wedding photo. She and James looked impossibly young, beaming as though nothing could touch them. For a moment, her heart ached. Their love had been real, and so had their struggles. She remembered the arguments, the moments of loneliness even within marriage, and the painful day she stood at his funeral. She set the photo aside and reached for a manila folder. Inside were medical records, reminders of her surgery after a heart scare in her early 60s. She traced her name on the paperwork, remembering the sterile hospital rooms, the beeping machines, the nights she wondered if she would ever see her children again. Then she found letters from her daughter during college, pages filled with dreams, questions, and sometimes resentment. Margaret had not always been the mother she wished she had been. She remembered moments of impatience, words spoken too sharply, times when she worked too much and listened too little. By the time she reached the bottom of the box, she felt a heavy tide rising in her chest. She whispered to herself, "I should have done more. I should have been better. I should have been different." That voice was familiar, the same inner critic that had followed her for decades. It told her she had failed, that she wasn't enough. But then another thought surfaced, uninvited yet steady. If your best friend came to you with this same box, would you tell her she failed? Would you tell her she wasn't enough? Or would you hold her hand and say, "You've been through so much. I honor your strength"? Margaret froze, the question echoing in her mind. She imagined her oldest friend, Carol, sitting on the couch, holding the very same box of regrets. Margaret knew exactly what she would say. "Carol, look at all you've endured, all you've learned. Don't you see how strong you are? Don't you see how much love you've given?" Tears welled in her eyes. Why was it so easy to offer compassion to others, yet so hard to offer it to herself? She placed her hand gently over her heart. "I have lived. I have endured. I am still here." The words felt awkward at first, but as she repeated them softly, they began to sink in. It occurred to her that every scar, emotional or physical, was not a sign of weakness but a record of survival. The heart surgery scar across her chest, the ache in her knees, the grief etched into her soul after losing James. These were not failures. They were evidence that she had walked through fire and emerged still breathing. She remembered a phrase she once read: "Scars are proof that you were stronger than what tried to break you." Margaret leaned back on the couch, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. She thought of the times she had fallen and risen again. The nights she stayed awake worrying for her children. The mornings she went to work exhausted but determined. The moments she had chosen kindness when bitterness would have been easier. None of it was perfect, but it was real, and it was hers. She realized then that compassion for the journey meant more than forgiving mistakes. It meant seeing the whole picture, the shadows and the light, the storms and the calm seas, and honoring it all as part of her story. That night, before bed, she stood in front of her mirror once again. But instead of criticizing, she placed her hand on her chest and whispered, "I have lived. I have learned. I have endured. I am worthy of love." Her voice trembled, but the words felt like planting seeds in dry soil. Seeds that, with care, might one day bloom into something steady and strong. And perhaps that was the lesson. Self-love didn't need to be forced. It could begin with the smallest act of compassion, offered to oneself like a cup of water to a thirsty plant. Margaret turned off the light, climbed into bed, and pulled the blanket around her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, the critic inside her was quiet. In its place was a softer voice, almost like the voice of her younger self, whispering gently, "You've done enough. You are enough." It was a chilly Saturday morning when Margaret decided to clean out the drawer of her nightstand. She pulled out old journals stacked in uneven piles, their covers worn and faded. She had been writing in them for decades, recording everything from grocery lists to her most private fears. Settling into her armchair with a blanket over her lap, she opened one from her early 60s. She hadn't touched it in years. The handwriting was shaky but familiar, and as she began to read, a heaviness grew in her chest. Page after page carried the same refrain. "I'm too old. My best years are gone. I'm no longer useful." Her eyes stung. She could see how often she had spoken to herself in harsh tones, words that she would never dare say to another person. Each phrase felt like a stone she had laid upon her own heart, building a prison of negativity over the years. She whispered aloud, almost in disbelief, "Would I ever say these things to my daughter? To Lily? To anyone I love?" The answer was obvious. Of course not. She would never tell someone they were worthless, too old, or broken. And yet, she had repeated these words to herself countless times. That realization stopped her cold. It reminded her of something she once read about the Buddhist teachings. Right speech is not only about how we speak to others, but also how we speak to ourselves. Margaret closed the journal and placed her hand over it as if closing a chapter. "No more," she whispered. She stood up, walked to her dresser, and grabbed a fresh notebook. Sitting back down, she opened to the first page and wrote in big, bold letters, "New words." Then she began to replace her old phrases with gentler ones. Instead of "I'm too old," she wrote, "I am seasoned with wisdom." Instead of "My body is weak," she wrote, "My body has carried me through so much, and I honor it." Instead of "My best years are behind me," she wrote, "This moment is a gift, and I choose to cherish it." She read the words aloud, her voice shaking at first, then growing steadier. "I am seasoned with wisdom. My body has carried me through so much. This moment is a gift." Something shifted inside her. The words felt like balm on old wounds. Imagine this for yourself. How often do you repeat phrases that diminish you? "I'm too tired. I'll never be good enough. I'm falling apart." What if you replaced them, even for a single day, with words that lifted you instead of dragged you down? Margaret thought of her garden in the summer. She had once tried to revive a wilting rose bush by speaking kindly to it while watering it gently every day. To her surprise, within weeks, the bush had bloomed again, its blossoms brighter than she expected. Maybe hearts work the same way, she thought. The next morning, before she got out of bed, she tried something new. She placed her hand over her chest, took a deep breath, and whispered, "May I be at ease today. May I be kind to myself." The words felt simple, almost childlike. But as they lingered in the air, she felt her body relax. She rose with more energy than usual, not because her aches were gone, but because her spirit felt lighter. That evening, she tried again before sleep. I am enough, just as I am. At first, it felt awkward. Years of harsh words don't disappear overnight. But little by little, Margaret noticed the shift. When she caught herself grumbling, "I'm useless," while fumbling with a TV remote, she stopped and corrected it. "I'm learning even now." When she felt discouraged about her slower pace on her neighborhood walks, she reminded herself, "My body has carried me faithfully for nearly 70 years. That is something to celebrate." The more she practiced, the more natural it became. And something extraordinary happened. Her inner world began to soften. The prison of negativity she had built with harsh words slowly dissolved, replaced by a garden of gentle affirmations. One day, while on the phone with her daughter, Margaret accidentally said aloud, "This moment is a gift." Her daughter paused and said, "Mom, that's beautiful. I needed to hear that today." Margaret smiled, realizing that her practice was no longer just for herself. By choosing gentle speech within, she was changing the way she spoke outwardly too. Her daughter heard it. Her friends felt it. Even strangers at the grocery store noticed the warmth in her tone. Gentle words, she realized, ripple outward. That night, she sat by her window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She thought of all the years she had scolded herself, all the harshness she had carried inside. And then she thought of this new chapter, one where she chose words of kindness instead. She whispered once more, firmly this time, "I am enough. I am seasoned with wisdom. This moment is a gift." And for the first time in decades, she believed it. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret sat at her kitchen table one Sunday afternoon, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. The walls around her seemed to echo with silence. Years ago, this same kitchen would have been filled with noise. The chatter of her children, the clatter of dishes, the hum of life in motion. But now, her children had families of their own, her husband was gone, and most days she spent her hours in stillness. At first, solitude had felt unbearable. The silence whispered cruel lies. "You are forgotten. You're no longer needed. You are alone." She often turned on the TV just for background noise, or scrolled endlessly on her phone to escape the heavy emptiness. But no matter how much she tried to drown it out, loneliness always found a way back in. That afternoon, however, something shifted. She remembered a line she had once read. "Loneliness and solitude are not the same. Loneliness is the feeling of being incomplete. Solitude is the recognition that, in this very moment, you are already whole." Margaret set down her cup and let the words sink in. Could it be that the silence she feared was not an enemy, but a teacher? She decided to test it. She turned off the television. She placed her phone face down. Then she lit a small candle on the table, its flame flickering softly in the dim light of the room. She sat back, closed her eyes, and simply breathed. At first, her mind resisted. Thoughts swirled, lists of chores, worries about her children, the ache in her hip. The silence felt heavy, pressing in. But gradually, as she focused on her breath, she noticed something different. The quiet wasn't empty. It was alive. She could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of traffic outside, the rhythmic rise and fall of her own breath. The stillness was not mocking her, it was holding her. A sense of presence washed over her, like meeting a companion she had overlooked for years. Herself. Margaret opened her eyes and whispered softly, "Maybe I'm not alone after all." She decided to make it a practice. Each day, she dedicated a few minutes to sit with herself, not out of obligation, but as an act of love. Some days she sat in her living room with a candle. Other days she walked slowly through her neighborhood, listening to the rustle of leaves and the songs of birds. At first, the habit felt awkward. Her old fear of loneliness tried to creep back in. But with time, something extraordinary happened. The quiet no longer felt like absence, it felt like company. One evening, while sitting by her window, she noticed how the setting sun painted streaks of orange and purple across the sky. She realized that in solitude, she could finally see the beauty around her without distraction. She could feel the ground beneath her feet, the pulse of her breath, the gentle rhythm of life itself. She whispered, "I am in the company of life." The shift was profound. Loneliness had once told her she was forgotten, but solitude reminded her she was part of something vast and alive. Imagine this for yourself. Maybe your home feels too quiet now. Maybe the absence of voices weighs heavily on your heart. What if, instead of filling the silence with noise, you sat for a moment and listened? What if you discovered that the quiet was not an enemy, but an invitation to meet yourself more deeply? Margaret found herself actually looking forward to her moments of solitude. She realized that she no longer feared the empty room because she wasn't truly empty. She carried within her awareness, breath, memory, and presence. And in that presence, she found peace. One morning, during her walk, a neighbor greeted her warmly. Margaret returned the smile, and for the first time, she noticed how her solitude had made her more open, more grounded. She didn't feel desperate for connection. Instead, she could offer it freely without fear. Later that night, she wrote in her journal, "Solitude is not punishment. It is a gift. In the stillness, I find myself, and in finding myself, I am never truly alone." Margaret knelt in her backyard garden on a mild spring morning. The earth was damp from last night's rain, and she pressed her hands into the soil, planting marigold seeds in neat rows. The air carried the smell of fresh earth, mingling with the sweetness of blooming lilacs from her neighbor's yard. As she worked, she felt a wave of gratitude for the simple act of breathing in the morning air. She paused, resting her hands on her knees, and thought about something her doctor had once explained to her granddaughter. Every breath we take is a gift from the trees. They give us oxygen, and we give them carbon dioxide. It's a partnership. Margaret had nodded politely at the time, but now the meaning hit her differently. She inhaled deeply and realized she wasn't just taking in air. She was in a relationship with the world around her. The towering oaks at the edge of the yard, the grass beneath her, the very soil under her nails, all of it was part of her, and she was part of it. She whispered softly, "I'm not separate. I belong to this." For so long, she had carried the thought, "I am small. I am unimportant. My life doesn't matter anymore." But now she began to see how false that voice was. When she baked cookies and gave them to her neighbor's children, their laughter carried warmth through the block. When she offered a kind word to the cashier at the grocery store, she noticed the woman's tired shoulders relax just a little. When she volunteered at the library's reading program, the children leaned in, their eyes wide with curiosity at the stories she shared. Her existence mattered. It rippled outward in ways she could not always see. One afternoon, Margaret sat on a park bench, watching people pass by, joggers with headphones, couples holding hands, an elderly man feeding pigeons. She realized every single one of them was connected to her, though they might never know her name. The trees shading the path gave them all the same breath. The earth carried them all. "I am the universe expressing itself as me," she thought. The words startled her, but they felt true. When she had been younger, she often felt like she had to prove her worth, through achievements, through appearance, through productivity. But now she understood. Her very existence was already part of something vast and irreplaceable. That evening, she decided to try a new practice she had once read about, loving-kindness meditation. Sitting in her favorite chair, she closed her eyes and placed her hands over her heart. She whispered, "May I be peaceful. May I be healthy. May I be at ease." She repeated the words slowly, letting them sink into her body. Then she thought of her daughter. May she be peaceful. May she be healthy. May she be at ease. She thought of her granddaughter, then her neighbors, then the strangers she had seen at the park, and finally the entire world. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be at ease. As the words flowed, something inside her softened. The boundary between me and them began to dissolve. She realized that caring for herself was not selfish. It was part of a larger harmony. By tending to her own heart, she could radiate kindness outward like ripples on a pond. Imagine this for yourself. The next time you feel small, try this. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, And remember that the air filling your lungs is a gift from the trees, from the earth, from life itself. Remember that your smile, your patience, your presence, no matter how ordinary it feels, can touch someone else in ways you may never know. Margaret wrote in her journal that night, "To love myself is to honor the whole world reflected in me. I am not apart from life. I am life." And with that realization, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. Margaret stood in her bedroom one evening, adjusting the collar of her blouse before heading out to meet a few friends for dinner. As she fastened the necklace, her eyes caught on the scar just above her chest, the thin, pale line from her heart surgery years ago. For so long, she had hated that scar. It felt like a cruel reminder of fragility, an imperfection she couldn't erase. Whenever she dressed, she would carefully choose clothing that covered it, hiding it away as if it were something shameful. But that night, something different happened. She thought of a story her granddaughter had shared from art class, a lesson about a Japanese craft called Kintsugi. When a ceramic bowl breaks, instead of being thrown away, it's repaired with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The cracks aren't hidden, they're illuminated. The brokenness becomes part of the beauty. Margaret ran her fingers over her scar and whispered, "Maybe this is my gold." The thought carried her back through the years. She remembered the heartbreak of her divorce in her 40s, when she thought her family would never feel whole again. Yet, out of that fracture came resilience, independence, and the courage to stand on her own. She remembered the loss of James, her husband, and the unbearable silence of the nights that followed. But through that pain, she learned the depth of love and the strength to keep moving forward with compassion. She remembered failures at work, missed opportunities, regrets that once felt like permanent cracks in her life. Yet, each of those failures had shaped her wisdom, teaching her patience and humility. Every flaw had carved space for light to enter. That weekend, she went to dinner with her friends at a cozy diner in town. As they laughed over plates of pie and coffee, she noticed the lines on each of their faces, the small scars, the marks of surgeries or accidents. And she realized she didn't see brokenness. She saw stories. She saw survival. Why should it be any different for herself? She shared the Kintsugi story with her friends, holding her blouse slightly open so the edge of her scar was visible. "I used to think this made me less," she said. "But maybe it's like the gold in those bowls. Maybe this is what makes me beautiful." Her friends grew quiet, touched. One of them, Melon, rolled up her sleeve to show the mark left by a car accident years ago. "I always hated this," she admitted. "But maybe you're right. Maybe it's part of the story of who we are." They sat there for a moment, each woman looking at herself differently, less with judgment, more with reverence. When Margaret returned home that night, she stood again in front of the mirror. For once, she didn't hide the scar. She traced it with her finger and smiled. "These are the rivers," she thought, "that carry the story of my life." She realized that if she had been unbroken, she would not be who she was today. Without the cracks, there would be no compassion. Without the scars, there would be no resilience. Her mind wandered to an old oak tree she used to pass on her walks, a tree with a gnarled trunk, weathered bark, and deep knots. As a child, she had thought it looked ugly compared to the smooth young trees nearby. But over the years, she came to love that tree. Its scars were proof that it had endured storms, droughts, and seasons of change. And because of its strength, it offered the deepest shade. "Maybe I'm like that tree," she whispered. "Not perfect, but enduring, strong, beautiful because of the life I've lived." Imagine this for yourself. Think of the marks you carry, whether on your body, your heart, or your soul. The regrets, the failures, the scars. What if, instead of hiding them, you saw them as golden lines in the art of your life? What if you believe that your cracks are not where you broke, but where your light shines through? Margaret began a new ritual. Each time an old regret surfaced, instead of pushing it away, she whispered, "This too is part of my gold." When she caught sight of the wrinkles around her eyes, she said, "These are my smile maps." When she touched the scar on her chest, she reminded herself, "This is proof of my survival." Slowly, her perspective shifted. She no longer apologized for her flaws. She honored them. One evening, as she lit a candle before bed, she wrote in her journal, "My beauty does not lie in being unbroken. My beauty lies in the way I have been pieced back together, with love, with resilience, with compassion. I am whole, not because I am flawless, but because I have embraced every crack as part of my sacred design." And as the candlelight flickered across the room, she felt radiant, not in spite of her flaws, but because of them. The morning sun streamed gently through the curtains as Margaret stepped onto her front porch, a warm cup of coffee in her hands. The neighborhood was waking up, dogs barking in the distance, a paperboy tossing the morning news, the hum of life unfolding one more day. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the light kiss her face, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. She wasn't younger. Her knees still ached. Her reflection still carried lines, scars, and silver hair. But her heart had softened. She thought back over the journey of the past weeks, how she had learned to bow gracefully to impermanence, to see change not as an enemy, but as a reminder to cherish what was here now. How she had released the prison of the mirror, no longer tying her worth to an image, but to the life she had lived. She remembered offering compassion to herself as she sorted through old regrets, finally speaking the words she needed to hear. "You have endured. You are worthy of love." She smiled, thinking of the gentle language she now carried within her. No longer did she rise each morning with criticism on her lips. Instead, she spoke kindly to herself. "May I be at ease today. May I be kind to myself." The words had changed her from the inside out, and the silence, once unbearable, had become her companion. In solitude, she had discovered not emptiness, but presence. She realized that even in her quiet home, she was in the company of breath, of life, of her own awareness. She thought of the garden, of the trees that gifted her breath, of the strangers whose paths she crossed every day. She was not small. She was not separate. She was part of a vast web of life, her smile and patience rippling outward in ways she might never see. And finally, she touched the scar on her chest. Once hidden, once hated, now honored. Like gold in the cracks of a Kintsugi bowl, her flaws had become the most radiant parts of her. They were proof not of weakness, but of survival, resilience, and love. Margaret lifted her cup in a quiet toast to the sky. "Here I am. Older, yes, but not less. Maybe more radiant than ever." Imagine this for yourself. You don't have to be unbroken to be whole. You don't have to erase your years to be beautiful. The truth is, your life, with its scars, wrinkles, joys, and sorrows, is already a masterpiece. To love yourself in old age is to release the illusion that you are less than before. It is to embrace each moment as precious, to honor the journey you have walked, and to see your flaws as golden threads in the fabric of your soul. The Buddha once taught that true love is boundless. It isn't confined by youth, beauty, or time. It ripens as we grow older, as we release illusions and step into truth. And in that truth, there is freedom. Margaret stood quietly on her porch as the world stirred awake around her. She felt her own heart steady, filled not with longing for what was gone, but with gratitude for what remained. She whispered one last time, "I am enough. I am radiant. I am part of life's great unfolding." And in that moment, she knew. Aging had not taken away her ability to love herself. It had deepened it. Her story was not about loss. It was about transformation. Not about fading, but about glowing in a new, softer light. If this story touched your heart, don't let it stop here. Hit the like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that aging is not the end of love, but the beginning of a deeper journey. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel, because every story we share is a chance to grow together. Tell us in the comments, what is one thing you've learned to love about yourself as the years have passed? Your words might inspire someone else watching today. And if this video made you reflect on your own journey, you won't want to miss tomorrow's episode. It's about how one small change in daily self-talk can transform your entire outlook on life. Remember, your story doesn't end with age. It shines brighter because of it.